which North Sentinel is part of, have almost all acquiesced outside in the 19th century, the British made the islands a penal colony and attempted to coerce the islanders into submission by both impressing them with presence and with brute force. After the islands were given to India in the middle of the 20th century, the Indians have attempted to coerce the Andamanese into accepting coexistence with the island's massive population of Indian settlers with both presence and brute force, though they have at least tried to be a bit more compassionate and protective. Either way, all the groups that have opened themselves up to us are worse off for it. They've contracted horrible diseases, their land has been seized, their forests have been chopped down, estates have been poached, their populations have dwindled, and ultimately, their original way of life, so ancient it has no age, is going extinct. But that's not so for the Sentinelese. They're willing to accept the odd gift now and again, or at least they were, but if you overstay your welcome and ignore their warnings to leave, they'll riddle you with arrows. But even despite that, I was completely blown away by how much information there really is about this island, and how fascinating and deep the history of our ill-fated attempts at winning them over really is. Even though it's just a tiny little island in the middle of the ocean, you wouldn't believe how deep the story of this place goes. The iceberg I made in my attempt at summing up everything we know about the place is so dense, and by the way, I'm probably missing a lot, that I'm afraid we won't be able to cover everything on it. The video will just be way too long, and I've spent way too much time away to justify making it any longer than it is already. So today we'll be covering the top half of the iceberg, a summation of all the best known vignettes from the island's history, and all the baseline information about the Sentinelese and their closest relatives. So without further ado, let's begin. The John Allen Challenge 2018. Heard anything about North Sentinel Island, it's probably something involving this incident. The needless death of 26-year-old American evangelical missionary John Allen Chapel, who preached the gospel to the Sentinelese back in 2018. It made headlines all over the world. Many others have already covered the story in way more depth than I ever could, and there's a lot else to cover, so I'm just going to go over the basic facts, focusing on what exactly he saw and wrote about in the days immediately preceding his untimely demise on the island. Chow was an avid outdoorsman from just south of the border from in Vancouver, Washington. He was also an EMT, a soccer player, a globe trotter, and more importantly to him, a missionary. As such, it seems that he was fascinated by stories of adventure and survival beyond the limits of modern society, like Robinson Crusoe and Hatchet, from a pretty young age. But he was especially fascinated with stories of missionaries contacting and converting remote tribes in Africa and the Amazon. In a dark twist of irony, especially drawn to the story of Jim Elliot, one of 5 missionaries killed by Amazonian natives in the jungles of Ecuador back in 1956. After seeing that the people of North Sentinel Island were listed as being some of the last people on Earth who'd never heard of Christianity on a website called the Joshua Project in high school, an idea began taking shape in Chow's mind. Maybe he could be the one to share the good news to them and save their souls. He later wrote, "The eternal lives of this tribe is at hand." At least that's what he seemed to think, since he also infamously referred to the island as the Devil's last stronghold, which doesn't even make that much sense. I mean, there's still pagans a bit further east in the islands of Melanesia. This idea grew and grew until his goal in life was to live among the Sentinelese and convert them to his particular brand of evangelical Christianity. He even referred to it as his clothing, one of his final notes, and thanks God for his messenger, even before I was yet formed in my mother's womb. So he definitely had a sense of destiny, if you can call it that. Contrary to popular misconception, he was not a Mormon. I know, it's a bit surprising, eh? Anyways, regardless, the guy was ready and willing to spend the rest of his life on the island. He even eschewed getting into relationships or having a full-time job because of it. Eventually, he even got in touch with a missionary organization named All Nations based in Kansas City, Missouri, and went through missionary boot camp, which consisted of role-playing as missionaries making first contact with hostile tribesmen, played by the staff of All Nations. As if there were any world where that could possibly predict how the Sentinelese would react to Chow's presence. Chow even learned Xhosa, a language spoken in South Africa, to communicate with the Sentinelese, presumably based on his assumption that an African language would somehow be intelligible to them, because they're one of the last representatives of the first wave of humans to reach Asia from Africa in the Paleolithic. Although he did pick up a few words in more local languages. He even spent a whole summer studying linguistics here in British Columbia at the Canada Institute for Linguistics, so he could translate the Bible to them. But I mean, that's sort of a fool's errand. As we'll see, there have already been multiple instances of people trying to communicate with the Sentinelese using the language of their closest surviving relatives from some of the closest islands to them. And that hasn't worked, so I don't think Xhosa would cut it. And as he would eventually and unfortunately find out, the islanders didn't want an outsider imposing themselves onto their island. Chow traveled to Port Blair, the capital of the Andamans and its oldest city, in mid-October of 2018 with fellow missionaries. This was actually his fourth trip to the islands, the first being made in 2015. He spent the tense days leading up to his trip to North Sentinel lying low in a bungalow he referred to as a safe house in this handwritten journal he made that's since been released by All Nations at Chow's own request. It's an incredible but very sad document, and from here on out, it's our main source on what Chow was up to. In the safe house, he prepared by praying, exercising, reading, and gathering together his kit, which included picture cards and gifts for the Sentinelese, as he was trying to persuade local fishermen to take him over to the islands, weighing out a sledgehammer. During this time, he went without direct sunlight for 11 days, but he finally found 5 fellow Christian fishermen that he wound up paying 25,000 rupees to, or about $350, for the privilege of being ferried to North Sentinel. By the way, the reason why he was lying low and had to pay the fishermen so much is because the Indian authorities strictly forbid travel anywhere within 5 nautical miles of North Sentinel Island, which we'll find out more about later. And to make matters even worse, he couldn't communicate with his escort because they didn't speak any English, and I guess he didn't speak any Hindi. He finally arrived off the island shores around 10:30 p.m. on November the 14th, which he said was thanks to God himself hiding us from the Coast Guard and many patrols. In the early hours of the morning the next day, he and 2 officials made their first foray onto the island. Chow specifies that they waded out into the shallows around the northern curve of a cove on the southwestern shore of the island, probably near a place now just called Alice Point. And they did so to stash Chow's collapsible kayak and some gifts for the Sentinelese. Addendum. Actually, as a quick correction, I saw the term Alice Point was used on a map of the island published in a book from 1990, so in an incredibly dark twist of irony, the place where John Allen Chow was about to lose his life shared the same name as him. It's remarkable that the dead coral that the ground is made up of is extremely sharp. This coral used to be well underwater, but was uplifted by the 2004 Indian earthquake and forms a ring around the island. The wreckage of a ship, probably the MV Rusley, which was wrecked off the coast in the 70s, is said to lie right near here on coral that's since been uplifted. So, hey, it wasn't Russian metal. I think this ruddy stain on Google Earth is what remains of it. But later that morning, Chow spotted and even hastily drew one of the sorts of lean-to huts that other expeditions to the island had documented. Temporary lean-tos are used as shelters that the islanders and other related Andamese groups used during their hunting expeditions. And the fact that fires have been found in them, a detail which also seems to show up in Chow's drawing, might also point to them being the dwellings of specific families. And that hut, Chow decided to focus all of his efforts. He and the fisherman waved his hand and squawked to attract attention to themselves. No use. The fishermen were no longer going to go any closer to the island than half a mile, so Chow retrieved his kayak with nothing but black underwear, which he thought would make the islanders more comfortable with him since they always go naked, and with nothing much more than a barracuda and half of a tuna, which he plopped on top of the kayak as he rowed towards the hut. When he was about 400 yards out, he began hearing some women chattering in the distance and asked some of the Sentinelese characteristic dugout shoes, complete with outlets. But it wasn't long before he met two armed men, two unstrung arrows each came rushing out to help him. One of the last ones describes how he began mechanics-like, essentially swung their arrows. So he threw the tuna at them, calling, "My name is John. I love you. Jesus loves you. He doesn't clarify with English, Kosa, but either way, the had no idea what they were screaming, and they kept coming. So after sliding Barracuda off the prow of the kayak, he turned and paddled like I never have in my life back to the fisherman's boat, though he also collapsed and stashed the kayak somewhere in the reef again. Chow was frightened, but was mostly just disappointed that the Sentinelese hadn't accepted him straight away. But still determined, he returned yet again later that same day, a few hours later, and made landfall around the same hut on the southwestern coast, where he brought out gifts like scissors, cord, and safety pins, fishing line, hooks, and rubber hosing that he placed on top of a log that he thought must have been placed where it was by one of the Sentinelese. In addition to 2 groupers the fisherman had just caught in the island's waters, he also brought along an emergency kit, especially for arrow wounds, that included things like abdominal pads and forceps if he needed to ever extricate any arrowhead out of his flesh, picture cards for communicating, multi-tools, and of course, multivitamins, his passport, and a waterproof Bible.
Dreaming of big roller coasters and bigger-haired Hollywood, or maybe small-town tourist worlds? For adventures of all sizes, use Hollywood's travel insurance to protect you, your trip, and your peace of mind.
He headed towards what he thought was a dilapidated or maybe even destroyed shelter along the northern end of the cove, hoping to encounter the Sentinelese again. But that area seemed pretty devoid of life. So he headed towards where he first encountered the islanders a few hours earlier at the hut. Interestingly, he theorized that maybe the dilapidated hut had been built by poachers, based on the fact that he saw numerous rocky coral that jut out of the cove having lines wrapped around them. Half a dozen of the 10 bewildered islanders in the hut began to shout, and when Chow tried in vain to repeat the phrases the Sentinelese seemed to be yelling at him, they just burst out laughing. So as he suspected, they were probably crashing. One of the only clips of the Sentinelese speaking is one of them really with the documentary crew pretty much the same They also began yelling back into the forest. Chow counted hearing some kind of drumming from within it. Then he saw some guy wearing what seemed to be a white crown made of what he thought might have been flowers, shouting at him from atop the highest coral boulder in the area. In the meantime, he sang some worship songs and spoke some Kosa, which the Sentinelese seemed to tolerate in silence. At some point, he even used some phrases in Jarawa, spoken by some of the Sentinelese' closest relatives on the island of South Andaman, which is actually pretty clever and may have actually worked in the past, as we'll see, but nevertheless, they did not seem to understand them. 2 men did drop their bows and began approaching his kayak and their canoe, which they propelled through the water with poles. They initially ignored the gifts he'd set aside for them on the log, but quickly turned back to grab them. He noted that if they see something they like, they'll take it by force if necessary. I wonder how many other folks have given them something, and if they feel like it's expected or due them. By the way, he was right in thinking that. But regardless of Chow's gifts, the Sentinelese seemed to be reaching the limit of what they could tolerate, and things soon went south. He heard some more yelling as a boy and a young woman appeared behind the men who just received the gifts, with their bows drawn. Chow says, "I kept waving my hands to say no bows, but they didn't get the message, I guess." He tossed his last gift, what he describes as a shovel or adze, midway between him and the islanders. But even though the adze is the Sentinelese tool of choice, it didn't make much of an impact. Soon the Sentinelese had almost encircled him. One unarmed man blocked his exit. Another came forward with a knife, so he figured this was it, and decided that this would be the ideal time to start preaching from Genesis, and stepped out of his kayak to show that I too have legs, as if that's why they wanted him gone. At this point, one of the men was just mere inches from him, and he noticed that he had yellowish pigment in circles on his cheeks, which interestingly does mirror the practices of the Sentinelese' closest relatives, the Ongis, and matches 19th century descriptions of the Sentinelese themselves. But then, the next thing he knew, a boy he estimated to be about 10 years old shot at Pharoah holding over his chest. Chow saw that the arrowhead was metal, thin, and very sharp. That is how arrows fired. Hades was driving. Made of iron. Chow wrote, I stumbled back, called yelling at me for shooting me, but he decided to ignore the obvious and put an optimistic spin on things. Now as I look back at it, my Bible cover looks like bark, like tree bark. So maybe he was just curious, but yikes, it just gave me a fright. But he still couldn't escape feeling crushed. In one of his final messages, he wrote, I've never felt this much grief or sorrow. Why? In all caps. Why did a little kid have to shoot me then? His high-pitched voice still lingers in my head. He even theorized that the Sentinel's hostility rose from ancestral memories escaping from some slave ship. And without thinking, Chow tossed the arrowhead back to the kid, which he later regretfully wrote about. But as they've done in the past with others, the Sentinelese let him off with a warning yet again, and left him alone as they let him swim the miles down to the fisherman's boat, since they did decide to pound his kayak. As he was watching the sunset, he wrote, wondering if it'll be the last sunset I see, or being in the place where the sun never sets. Why does this beautiful place have so much death? I hope this isn't one of my last notes, but if it is, God be with me. He was last seen alive by the fisherman the next day. He decided to be dropped off alone in one of the cabins. There, he walked down the beach to the same hut he had just come from. He deliberately decided to meet the Sentinelese without the fisherman's boat nearby, and wrote that he only intended for them to return the following night, because he thought that maybe the presence of the boat was spooking the Sentinelese. He even mentioned how he knew of a fellow missionary who had successfully met with one of the Sentinelese relatives, the Jarawa, with no boat nearby. But he had another reason for this. If he was killed, then at least the fisherman wouldn't have to bear witness. Apparently those 2 points made him feel at peace with the whole plan. The following morning, Chow would launch his third and final attempt at approaching the islanders after writing a final 3-page journal entry in pencil, mostly consisting of farewell messages to his family and friends. Writing, you guys might think I'm crazy in all this, but I think it's worth it to declare Jesus' name. Please do not be angry with them or at God, and that the eternal lives of this tribe is at hand, and I can't wait to see them around the throne. A day or so later, after returning from their normal fishing routine, the fishermen complicit in illegally ferrying Chow to the island watched as his lifeless body was dragged along the beach with a rope and buried. According to an email sent by a fellow missionary to Chow's mother, he was never to be seen again. The Indian authorities have since prosecuted 7 people involved, but the question over what, if anything, can be done for Chow's remains still lingers. A helicopter was sent to assess the situation on the 20th of November, and on the 24th, both those local policemen came to the site of Chow's death, hoping to procure the body. They wisely maintained a distance of some 400 meters away from the beach, where they stared down the Sentinelese in a tense standoff. Nothing more was done, and frankly, it didn't probably stand that way. A murder case was opened, but that's understandably been heavily criticized, and it's not like any of the Sentinelese are ever going to be arrested for this. And Chow himself wrote, don't retrieve my body. Different people have reacted to Chow's failed mission in wildly different ways. Some of his fellow missionaries praise him as a martyr, others doesn't call him an idiot. But I personally don't think he's either. I do truly admire that he was so committed to his dream and to serving something bigger than himself, that he really he had perished for it. But at the same time, his presence on the island put the people he was trying to help in mortal danger. Admittedly, he was vaccinated for 13 different illnesses and quarantined himself before going to the island. But who knows what pathogen he could have, maybe did, unwittingly transferred. As we'll see, their relatives of the larger and more populous areas were completely decimated by horrible diseases unwittingly brought by the Brits. And some maybe already got to the island. These people have no immunity to diseases we don't even think about. But the main point of Chow's idea was just the fact that he didn't do his research. I mean, he did research. He compiled a giant dossier on his plans to ingratiate himself with the Sentinelese, complete with a map of safe landing sites. But he just chose to ignore so many aspects of the island's historical context. First, the islanders have never allowed outsiders to stay on their island without either A, melting into the island's dense jungle interior to wait for the right moment to strike, or B, immediately confronting the trespassers with a hail of arrows. So for a brief period in the early 90s, that wasn't the case, and there was some friendly contact between outside parties and the Sentinelese, but we'll get to that at the end of the video. And the one time a British colonial official named Maurice Vidal Portman was able to force his way into the interior without an immediate response in 1880, he forcibly abducted an elderly couple and some children. You know what happened to those Sentinelese that Portman kidnapped? The two elderly people sickened rapidly and died, and it's possible that Portman abused the children in the worst way possible. When Indian authorities again penetrated into the island's interior in 1967, some of its less scrupulous members raided the abandoned village they came across for souvenirs, and there's even evidence that the Sentinelese were the last recipients of a syphilis epidemic that ravaged across the islands in the 1880s. But we don't know who spread it or how. Was it the British? Was it contact with other Andamanese people infected by the British? Or maybe it was the Malay pirates that were accustomed to raiding the Andamans for slaves. And it's very possible that, just as Chow observed himself, the Sentinelese may still have to deal with the occasional unsavory poacher or smuggler from elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So though the untimely death of Chow undoubtedly is tragic, the point is, us outsiders have always left a bitter taste in the Sentinelese' mouth. And we always seem to go too far. So what's different now? The drunk fisherman incident of 2006. If you've heard anything else about North Central Island besides the unfortunate fate of John Allen Chow, you probably also heard of the similar fates which befell two Indian fishermen who found themselves illegally fishing in the restricted waters surrounding the island, which unfortunately meant that they didn't see the end of January 2006. Back in 1956, the Indian government passed the Andaman and Nicobar Island Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Act, which banned private visits to the island and forbid any boats from getting closer than 5 nautical miles, also to spare the Sentinelese from the contagious diseases the outsiders would inevitably transfer to them. Though that, of course, didn't stop official visits to them, but anyway, this exclusion zone was regularly patrolled by the Indian Navy and Coast Guard, at least ostensibly. Later on, we'll see that it's a bit more forced than it should be. The same kind of small fishing boat these two fishermen were piloting has become a common sight off the island in the late 90s, with residents of nearby Port Blair looking to privately take part as men of the cargo ship rotting on the reef. But what happened to these two fishermen seems like a pretty clear sign that to the Sentinelese, they were far from welcome. Sundar Raj and Pandit Tiwari were two ex-cons that somehow became friends in prison, despite going there for very different reasons. Raj had murdered his ex-wife, and Tiwari had been jailed for petty theft. After being released, they bought a fishing ticket with money reportedly dubiously siphoned off from the aid money sent to the islands after it was devastated by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. A couple of years later, in January 2006, the two men joined a convoy of ships fishing in the exclusion zone off North Sentinel, after setting off from nearby Wandoor. At some point, they reportedly got drunk on palm wine and fell asleep, and while they were unconscious, their boat began drifting towards the island. According to the other fishermen there that night, the two men were immediately encircled by a body of Sentinelese men armed with axes and were immediately killed, though possibly after escaping the boat and making a run for it. It's possible that the reason for this was that they aroused the Sentinelese anger by showing up unannounced and by not offering them in, since every other friendly Indian to the island did so. And there's a good chance that the Sentinelese have encountered other illegal poachers. We have no idea how that would have turned out, but ultimately we'll never know the exact motives of that. There was at least one attempted official gift-dropping expedition made in 2005, but it had also been a very long time since the last really friendly encounter between the Sentinelese and outsiders in the Northern Islands. One journalist also raised the possibility that there was actually testimony from the other poachers there on account of them, being there illegally and being unwilling to share concrete testimony and no autopsies done on the body, that maybe the two men had drunk themselves to death. What exactly happened to the bodies is big about what exactly went down. The Sentinelese, for their part, definitely weren't happy. Helicopters were attacking my helicopter with everything they had. Arrows were flying everywhere. Once it came back, though, the bodies were nowhere to be seen, but the Sentinelese were still hanging around, and obviously still pretty annoyed, so the helicopter crew drew the Sentinelese away from the rough positions of the bodies by flying to the other end of the island. When they followed it there, the helicopter made a beeline back where it had first spotted the bodies and somehow rediscovered them when its rotors kicked up the sand the Sentinelese had buried them in. According to one source, one of the fishermen's bodies was actually recovered, while the other had to be abandoned. But a more recent academic source reveals that the most the authorities were able to do was show the photos of the bodies, which it of course never revealed publicly, to one of the deceased's wives, and alluded to other family members being allowed to peek at the bodies from a distance with binoculars. The consternation of the local Indian settler community over the government's failure to retrieve the bodies was real, and some, like Sundaraj's wife, called for revenge against the island. She threatened to take her case to court and tried the Sentinelese and murder them. A bit ironic since she married one herself, but oh well. Conversations with the broader community also revealed that they generally felt that the Sentinelese ought to have been settled and made to work hard like them, so that their land could be put to better use, whatever that means. So thank God the situation didn't boil over into a hostile takeover, because it seems like it really could have been something. Tawari's family had the opposite response. His father said, "As far as I am concerned, the Sentinelese are victims, not my son. They live in constant terror, heavily armed poachers from Myanmar, Burma, and Port Blair. They were only defending themselves with bows and arrows and rocks, and the only way they know how. What I do want is my son's body, so my wife and I can cremate him. It is an impossible case to prosecute anyway." There was also some talk of mounting an expedition to retrieve the bodies after tensions had cooled down somewhat, but that never went anywhere. And it was only until I was writing this script that I discovered that a repeat of this exact thing happened at the tail end of 2023. This time, 3 fishermen, again from Wandoor, suddenly disappeared, with the only clue to their whereabouts being that their dinghy was spotted grounded on the shoals ringing North Sentinel Island. This time there weren't any bodies, but I'm pretty sure we can all guess what must have happened. Though at the time, the families reasoned that they were still alive. Talk of a rescue operation was reported. For whatever reason, the story doesn't seem to have gone international like the one from 2006, but it's still a very interesting case. The wreck of the MV Primrose, 1981. Shortly before midnight on August 2nd, 1981, a Panamanian train traveling from Bangladesh to Australia, cargo mostly feed and fertilizer, suddenly ran aground in a coral reef on the northwestern coast of North Sentinel Island. The wreck's hut, where it was photographed throughout the 90s, is still visible on Google Earth. Yet, way up there, the weirdest thing visible from satellite. So you've probably heard about it. Too rough for its crew of 28 to lower their lifeboats, so the captain opted to keep his crew on board, which turned out to be a very fortuitous decision given what was just about to happen. After 3 days of just sitting there, they finally caught a glimpse of their Sentinelli hosts, and they did not look very welcoming. At first they confused them with a rescue party, but that quickly changed when they brought out some binoculars and saw who they really were. Based on their hostile gestures and the fact that they were carrying bows and spears, the crew of the Primrose quickly realized the danger they were in and plunged into panic. And the captain immediately sent the following SOS message to their bosses at the Regent Shipping Company headquartered in Hong Kong. Wild men, estimate more than 50, carrying various homemade weapons or making 2 or 3 wooden boats, worrying they will board us at sunset. All crew members' lives are not guaranteed. Hilariously, a spokesman from the government of Hong Kong said the captain seemed like he'd gone bananas. He also requested an immediate airdrop of guns, which luckily doesn't seem to have ended up happening. The Primrose's crew kept up a 24-hour guard with whatever perceivable weapons they could find lying about, including a flare gun, some axes, and some bits of pipe. And even before the situation was resolved, it became a bit of a media sensation. And another spokesman from the Indian government even had to deny that the islanders were cannibals. We'll see where that myth comes from in a bit, but I can tell you that it involves Marco Polo. After almost a week had passed of this tense standoff, the stranded sailors were airlifted off the Primrose in a helicopter that had to make 3 different relays with a rope ladder dangled down to them. Luckily, the dramatic scene was captured in photographs taken by the pilot, an American named Robert Four, whose pictures eventually wound up in this Der Spiegel article. Apparently the wreck was initially like 400 feet off the coast, right across from a little spit, but given how much the island was uplifted in 2004, which we'll get to, it's basically right on it now. And if you play around with the dates of the satellite imagery of it, you can see that either sea levels around the island are rising, or the boat itself is sinking, since from 2011 on you can see the hull getting more and more submerged. And what's even more interesting is that the Primrose has a definite history post this incident, and there are actually eyewitness reports of the Sentinelese climbing up onto the boat with official shipbreakers on it and getting tired from it. Which leads us to our next topic, the 20th century Iron Age myth. And this leads me to one of the most widespread myths about the Sentinelese, that they didn't have iron until shipwrecks like the Primrose started running aground on the island's reefs, which just isn't true, but I don't blame you for not knowing that. The references to the Sentinelese and other possessing iron tools will be buried in really old books and websites, and before looking into them for this video, I thought that too. I even remember bringing it up as a fun fact about them pretty recently, but as I've also learned, the Sentinelese destroy every expectation you have of them at every corner of the turn. Despite their extreme isolation, the Sentinelese make enormous iron arrowheads, knives, and adze heads, which wound them or punch them to larger animals. For context, an adze is like a size axe. Its stone precursor was super popular back in prehistory, and curiously, stone examples were popular until relatively recently in the South Pacific. Here's some footage of the Sentinelese using their iron examples to rake the coconuts thrown at them. I love how nonchalantly they swing them over their shoulders. It just looks so natural for some reason. Maybe I have blood memory from the Neolithic, who knows. My weird prehistory-based fantasies aside, reports of iron being in demand in the Andamans go back way further than you'd think. When the Chinese monk Yi Tsing was passing by the island, which he referred to as the land of the naked people, on his way to India in the early 670s AD, he reported that when the natives saw our vessels coming, they eagerly embarked in little boats, their number being fully 100. They all brought coconuts, bananas, and things made of rattan cane and bamboo, which to exchange them. What they are anxious to get is iron only. For a piece of iron as large as 2 meters, one gets from them 5 to 10 cocoa nuts. The natives live solely on cocoa nuts and tubers. There is not much rice, and therefore what they hold most precious and valuable is loha, the name for iron. There is a possibility that he's referring to the Shompen people of the Nicobars just south of the Andamans here, because he explicitly says that the population was not black. The Andamans definitely are, but there's solid evidence of iron being imported in the form of an identifiable piece of iron ore at the bottom of the crater of a site just west of Port Blair called Chaldari, and it was dated 2,300 years ago. Although very much in line with Hastings' account, there of the travelers in the 9th century reported that when a ship passed the meter, the men come out of the boat of various sizes and part of amber coconuts of iron. One more recent, still quite a while back, the captain of another boat that ran aground on north central reefs, the Nineveh, reported that the weapons that he and his crew were at the pointy ends of were tipped with what else but iron. Then later on, a certain colonial administrator named Maurice Vidal Portman, who we'll definitely be rounding back to, noted that the presents which the Onkeys most appreciate are hoop iron, raw iron, files, anything that apples, coconuts, plantains, etc., etc. Now, the Ongies are pretty universally recognized as being the Sentinel's closest living relatives. When an official Indian gift roll was put to Buck in 1974, essentially inspired an era of film director, and it hit his thigh. Luckily, it was only a flesh wound, but the anthropologist accompanying them, Triloknath Pandit, noted that it was a bit of iron fashioned like a nail. He noted seeing a similar arrowhead that was fired into the water and then retrieved by its shooter in 1987. That same year, he spotted an iron arrowhead that he described as a trident. The Sentinelese have very unique multiple-headed arrowheads, each one stored in the European Museum, which we'll get back to later. DK Pandit, who we're going to be hearing tons more about, also became one of the only people ever to walk inside the village back in 1967 on his first expedition to the island. The village was deserted, but he observed a number of interesting artifacts, including 2 stones identified as one more trace of having a stone full of sharp stones, and the other was more rounded and even seemed to have a built-in grip. The Sentinelese probably used these sorts of objects to hold towards their iron. The eyewitness accounts of the Sentinelese taking part in the grapple those in the island had yet another dimension of the holocaust, shows that they even have preferences to certain types of iron scrap, probably because of how limited their part of the entire work. The following quote comes from the 5 Mohammed brothers, a family of shipbreakers based in Port Blair, who officially auctioned the rights to salvaging the wreck in 1991, and routinely went back and forth to the island for the better part of the 90s. According to a fascinating interview with one of them in 1993 by another Indian anthropologist, Vishwajit Pandya, when I went with my workers to start recovering, cutting out all the covers and stuff on those ships, we were all worried. The Sentinelese were far away, so we still carried a firearm, throwing a gun to scare the tribe. Just in case, on reaching the location, evidence that somebody had been on the deck of the parts of the ship, on firewood, candlesticks, and paper wrappers and bottles. These were obviously left by fishermen who came forward to gather what they could. After 2 days, early morning, like first time, news with about a dozen men about 50 feet away from the deck of the perimeter. We were skeptical and scared and had no other solution but to bring out our supply of bananas and show it to them to attract them and minimize the hostility. They took the bananas and came up on the floor, frantically looking around for smaller pieces of metal scrap. Much of what our workers cut off with torchlight and the welding point was a major scare, something we discovered every time they visited us. We, however, would oblige them with small pieces iron rod, but they preferred flat strips, which we did provide them. They visited us regularly, at least twice or thrice in a month, while we worked at the site for about 18 months, excluding the heavy rains. So like they had regular close encounters with the hardly anyone knows about it because nothing happened. Hostile when they said nothing got often while just think about it. The exact same place as the original cruise Primrose that everyone was children. Sometimes stone. Because of that, they noticed that metal gets more luster when it's rubbed, just like the shiny abalone inside shells. Vishwajit Pandya even recounts that he was irritated by how the Ongi men he was with were constantly rubbing their iron blades with a type of wedge-shaped whetstone they call tajagi that they carry everywhere. And I love this quote from him. The noise of the metal scraping against stone is referred to as yushia, a piece of onomatopoeia that is also used to describe the call of the dugong. For some reason, there's also occasional reference to gold being on the islands. Niccolo Conti in the 15th century said the name Andaman, obviously the precursor of Andaman, meant island of gold, though he didn't have very many things to say about it other than anyone who landed there would immediately be torn to pieces. Eat Singh explained to his readers that this island does not produce iron at all. Gold and silver also are rare. so does that mean they had it or not? But regardless, a more important question is, how have they managed to get their hands on a steady enough supply of iron to justify making these large iron tools for possibly millennia? The ships that occasionally found themselves wrecked off the island probably weren't enough to supply the Sentinelese with the iron they needed, which raises the possibility that they may have had even more extensive relationships with outsiders than we'd think in order to obtain it. Although most medieval mentions of the Andamans are pretty explicit about how dangerous it is to find yourself on them, maybe repetitions of the sort of canoe-to-ship, spur-of-the-moment trade deals Sing and the Arab travelers describe were happening on a more regular basis than we'd think. But there is a third possibility. George Webber, on his excellent archived site all about the Andamanese, outlines a really unique legend the Andamanese have about how they first encountered iron. The first man, named either Tomo or Dooku, went on a fishing expedition one day and shot an arrow. He missed his target and instead struck a hard substance that proved to be a piece of iron. The legend states that this was the first iron found by the natives. From the new substance, Dooku made himself an arrowhead, with which he also scarified or tattooed himself. He then sang a ditty to the effect that now that he was scarified, nothing could strike him. Weber raises the possibility that this might be recounting the chance discovery of meteoric iron, since there are no known iron deposits on the Andamans, though I think it might just be referring to some piece of iron junk that washed up on a beach somewhere. Maybe that's another way the Sentinelese have been getting their iron. Though then again, last time I checked, metal doesn't flow too well. Tsunami Uplifting Event 2004. On Boxing Day of 2004, a devastating tsunami ripped through the Indian Ocean and hit the Andamans hard. Thousands of Indians on the main islands lost their lives, and the rescue efforts were painfully slow. Eventually, the Indian government decided to dispatch a helicopter to check in on the Sentinelese, expecting the worst. But when it flew over the island, it found its occupants alive and healthy enough to face the helicopter down with their bows. Boats also reportedly came by to see how they were doing, but met with the same response. And the pictures from this of blurry, uncontacted tribespeople facing down a helicopter with such ancient tech fired people's imaginations the world over. And prior to the untimely death of John Allen Chau, the taking of these photographs was probably the most well-known vignette in the island's history. And it's still a pretty well-known story, but there's a bigger picture, as per usual. The aerial survey wound up citing 32 living Sentinelese and no casualties, but the earthquake that created that tsunami completely changed the makeup of their island, and their way of life must have changed with it. Parts of the island were uplifted 1 to 2 meters, while other parts sunk, though generally the shallow coral reefs around the island dried up, and even some small outlying islands, like Constance Island, just off its southeastern corner, were joined to the mainland. So North Sentinel actually grew quite a bit, but an expedition sent out to them in 2005 found out that wasn't exactly ideal for the Sentinelese. Vishwajit Pandya, who was part of it, later wrote, "I realized that the aerial photographs or the satellite images could not convey the scale and nature of the place. That's because that extra land affair was just a 70 to 150 foot wide barrier of stinking sun-dried coral created what seemed to be an impassable barrier between North Central's former beach and the new coastline. I mean, do you want to walk over these 70 feet of Legos just to get your toes wet? No, so obviously that doesn't apply everywhere on the island, and there's still bits of the water is still pretty close to the trees. But this has definitely thrown a wrench in the sort of gift drops the Indian authorities have been conducting on the Sentinelese since 1967. Pandya says, now it is not contact parts denied it is possible for the Sentinelese to drag their canoes onto the sandy shore and launch it into the sea. In fact, during my 2005 visit, after a long search, we did spot a group of 6 Sentinelese standing and staring at us, waiting for the gunny bags full of coconuts to be cast away. It was practically impossible for them to come towards the waterline. The bags of coconuts were dropped, but the Sentinelese didn't manage to collect it, nor could we deposit it for them. But they've clearly been able to adapt somehow. I mean, they're still out there, and they certainly don't seem to want any help from us, so good for them. And it's a bit ironic that the Sentinelese, as well as their better understood cousins on the bigger Andaman Islands, the Ongis and the Jarawa, managed to withstand the tsunami better than its modern settlers, despite how advanced they are in comparison. Maybe the Sentinelese had a better understanding of early warning signs modern people just aren't as attuned to, like the movements of birds and the behavior of animals, or just the fact that the earth shook and the waters receded for a moment. Both the Yongis and the Jarawa reportedly had the intuitive understanding that they needed to get to higher ground, deeper in their forests, because of their folklore telling them to do just that when the right signals came. The zoo hypothesis. This refers to the pretty popular idea that the Sentinelese are a real-life example of the zoo hypothesis, the philosophical notion that Earth is just a big zoo for super advanced aliens who could otherwise easily wipe us out, but instead walk us to the Atlantic. And I guess that's maybe occasionally visiting us on the coast to see how we react. That seems to describe the nature reserve better than the zoo, but you get it. It's pretty similar to how we think the Sentinelese, and so the Sentinelese are often evidence that it's at least possible. Just think of what it must be like from their perspective. Yeah, I'm sure they understand by now that we're just people like them, though early on some other enemies did think of outsiders as ancestral ghosts. They do, however, technology. They can't possibly fathom deal with ease by people whose origins and motives and intentions are totally inconceivable. Like, what the hell was going through their heads when they saw that guy's blowtorch? What do they even think motorboats and cargo ships are? Do they understand that they're just bigger versions of the outrigger canoes they use and the washed-up fishing dinghies they're familiar with, or some kind of horrific mechanical monster, as some have suggested, that just so happen to die on their beaches once in a while? No wonder they're afraid of us getting too close, and they don't know that the squiggles they see on the boats people bring by are letters and numbers. They have no idea how our weapons work. They don't know why you need to use for them, and they certainly don't understand that pieces of colored paper with more squiggles on them mean they belong to India. It's a cool concept, and hey, maybe it's true. I mean, it would definitely explain all the UFO news that's been coming out, I guess. You might expect this entry to be lowered down because of how existentially freaky it is, but I think in general it's one of the best known things associated with the island. March of 2025, a 24-year-old small-town American travel blogger named Kylo Polyakov was arrested by the Indian authorities after landing on North Sentinel Island. He didn't want to proselytize or try to establish any relationship. No, he just did it for the views. It was just a publicity. Of course, right to North Island, when the Taliban controlled Afghanistan for the same reason, uploading a moderate Blackboard series on it. Channel pretty detailed here. Know about it, it seems. He got to the island in an inflatable boat for Suzuki Motor assembled at a local wood dock attached to it and launched to a place called Burma Dairy South End around 1 in the morning. During a 5-minute-long early morning foray onto one of the island's beaches, he didn't even meet any Sentinelese. He just left a half-run canonized boat and a coconut on the ground and collected some useless sand samples. The footage on his GoPro was hounded by Union police anyway, so he made it. He doesn't even have a video to show for it. Although, for us, really hope that range from that. Imagine how many pieces. For all we know, the island is suffering from a horrible epidemic right now because of polio. We don't know. We're just looking at the guy's first attempt at reaching the island. In October of 2024, he tried using an inflatable kayak to get over there, presumably also to South Andaman, but staff some elderly stations were able to stop him. Then he visited the island again in January of 2025 when he illegally reported to the Jarawa, some of the Sentinelese closest relatives, on Pharoah Island. But after this latest incident, he was taken to a local court and remained in police custody for at least 3 days. And there was some uncertainty over where he was and what had happened to the YouTube channel. Apparently he's out. Just 3 days ago, at the released a teaser for an upcoming video about his stunt on the island, which consists of footage of the island from a plane above it, and Interestingly, some of the footage he took while on the boat heading to or from the island itself. So maybe he was somehow able to negotiate the footage back, or maybe this is from his first attempt on that kayak. I'm not sure. How many are there? The answer to this question, as with most other questions us in the outside world ask an outdoor sentinel, is that there isn't an answer. We just don't know. But there are some rough guesses. And by rough, I mean rough. Because the estimates of how many living sentinels there are range from a measly 15 to a whopping 400, even 500. Because again, they're all just educated guesses. The 2011 says that the population stands at a measly 15. TK Pandit, who I think has to qualify for the leading expert on the Sentinelese because he literally wrote the book on them based on his interactions with them over decades, from 1967 to 1991, guesses that there were some 80 to 100 of them at the time. That might not sound like a lot, but even Pandit himself says that that's an optimistic estimate and clarified that, besides, the area of the island is about 60 square kilometers, which would normally support a population of only about 40 from hunting, gathering, and economy standards, whereby one man roughly needs about 1.5 square kilometers of forest land to survive. But that ignores the fact that they have rich sea resources all around the island. And it also estimates that a single sea turtle weighing 15 to 50 kilograms could support a whole band of 20 to 30 people for a couple of days. And in any case, groups of up to 30 to 60 people have actually been observed on the beach in single encounters. But a lot of the time, the expeditions Pandit was attached to didn't encounter anyone, much smaller groups of 2 to 12, suggesting to him that they must keep moving around in search of food and lead a semi-nomadic existence. More recently, another leading expert on the Sentinelese, Vishvajit Pandya, has a less optimistic take, based on his own observations from being to the island 3 times between 1993 to 2005, and just the general consensus among administrators in Port Blair. He thinks the population stands at about 40, and the historical estimates he selected are quite variable, and this 500 in particular is incredibly realistic. Shows a little bit of gradual decline. It seems so odd. Imagine if 40 people are at the heart of all this intrigue and fascination and controversy and debate surrounding North Sentinel. The Close Encounters, 1991. The Sentinelese had been regularly visited by Indian gift-dropping missions, which mostly just gave them endless bags of coconuts throughout the 70s and 80s. The islanders were mostly happy with their gifts, but understandably didn't let their uninvited guests get anywhere near them, and when they overstayed their welcome, the Sentinelese would respond with open hostility. But they finally chose to break out of their shells a bit and allowed the outsiders to get the closest they've ever and probably will ever get to them in 1991, when they willingly approached at least 2 different Indian contact parties to make hand-to-hand contact with them. The many encounters between the Indian authorities and the Sentinelese that took place prior to this, which were spearheaded by that anthropologist guy, Triloknath Pandit, are equally interesting, especially since they provide us some of our only peeks at what lies inside the island's mysterious interior. But I decided to leave those juicy details for later, because the events of 1991 probably comprise the best-known amicable encounters between the Sentinelese and the modern world. On January 4th, 1991, a gift-dropping mission was sent to North Sentinel Island again. Pandit wasn't involved this time, and his colleagues, Madhumala Chattopadhyay and S.A. Arawati, along with the whole gathering of bureaucrats who competed to take part in the expedition. They approached one of the islands in a motorized team launched from a ship named the MV Tarmugli, which must have been a familiar sight to the Sentinelese because that same ship had been routinely reused to ferry contact parties to and from the island for decades at this point, since at least 1970. At first, none of the Sentinelese were coming out, but then a few of them stepped out of the jungle and began making gestures the anthropologists seemed to have correctly identified as pleas for gifts. They also appeared unarmed, which is somewhat unusual, though not completely unprecedented. Instead, they were carrying some net baskets and some more giant bags, presumably to grab As the Indian contact party began served by waded into the water, and some others got into one of their canoes to retrieve them. The contact party just but that's when their usual caution and the crew started to lunch. They returned that afternoon and witnessed something remarkable. One Sentinelese guy started getting fidgety with his bow and arrow, but then some older woman began reprimanding him for it, and the visit commenced peacefully after he ritually buried them in the sand. So the Sentinelese sort of literally buried the hatchet. This materialized out of the forest and wade to the dinghy, and then they just began exchanging coconuts hand to hand. Ironically, one of the people photographed doing this, S.A. Awaradi, a local director of tribal welfare, had written a poignant argument for leaving the islanders completely alone almost exactly a year before. And he wrote, "What right does the modern man have got to interfere in the totally isolated tribal life of the Sentinelese? What right does he have to decide unilaterally to impose his friendship on the Sentinelese who has been vehemently resisting it? Is it not their fundamental community right to live their own way, which they have been enjoying time immemorial?" Pandit attempted to replicate this kind of close encounter just a few weeks later at the same location, perhaps with the hopes of cementing their newfound friendly relationship. His party were greeted by another big group of Sentinelese, and they arguably got even closer than before. In addition to wading up to the expedition's dinghy, 2 Sentinelese men even clambered aboard, which tends to happen during gift drops to their cousins, the Pharoah. Pandit later told the BBC, "We were puzzled why they allowed us. It was their decision to meet us, and the meeting took place on their terms." Pandit even jumped into the water himself, going neck deep as he distributed coconuts directly by hand to the Sentinelese, when previously he'd mostly just hurriedly dropped off bags of coconuts on the beach, run off, and wait to see when the ever-cautious Sentinelese would come out and get them. According to Pandit, there was no threat, no hostility, and he recounts that for a few minutes he was alone in the water, completely surrounded by the Sentinelese. But after Pandit became separated from the main body of Indians, the Sentinelese made it all too clear that they had had enough. When a young Sentinelese man, or boy, made a funny face, drew his knife out, and mimed cutting Pandit's head off. So, seeing where things were going, Pandit made the smart choice to immediately get the dinghy to pick him back up. He was familiar with how the islanders tell people to screw off, later telling Indian Express, "If we tried to venture into their territory without respecting their wishes or got too close for comfort, they would turn their back on us and sit down on their haunches, as if to defecate. That was meant to be an insult. If we didn't A-beat and stop, they would shoot arrows as a last resort." During past expeditions to the island, he had also witnessed the Sentinelese firing off warning shots from their bows that seemed to have been deliberately shot off while their targets were well trained. So the Sentinelese don't just arbitrarily riddle trespassers with arrows. They have the courtesy to give them some due warning. But besides the knife incident that ended this encounter, it's remembered as being mostly friendly and mostly characterized by smiles and excitement. Despite how exciting it was, though, Pandit couldn't help feeling a palpable sense of loss. He later told fellow author Adam Goodhart in the latter's New Delhi hotel room they must have come to a decision that the time had come, that they voluntarily came forward to meet us. It was unbelievable. It couldn't have happened on the spur of the moment. But there was this feeling of sadness. I did feel it. And there was the feeling that at a larger scale of people holding back, holding on, ultimately had to yield. It's like an arrow in history gone. The island was gone. Until the other day, the Sentinelese were holding the flag, unknown to them. They were being English, but they have also given up. Maybe he's reading a bit too much into it there, but I think it's pretty poignant. And because of the magnitude of this occasion, or at least its perceived magnitude, it's even been reported that after the whole thing was said and done, the debate over who first touched the Sentinelese became an emotionally charged issue within various sectors of the Andamanese administration, where claims and counterclaims were sought to be established with earnestness and vigor. The later 90s would also witness the Sentinelese' closest relatives, the come out of their jungle hideouts en masse and initiate contact with Indian settlers, who they had hitherto had a rather strained and violent relationship with. But for whatever reason, it was breakers, dismantling Primrose, and the Sentinelese themselves in the later 90s is really murky, and different sources contradict each other about its exact ending. Either way, the Sentinelese haven't opted to open up any further than they did in 1991, and I'm sure their unfortunate run-ins with fishermen and missionaries and maybe the odd poacher and, of course, YouTubers hasn't helped much. Addendum. A Nat Geo article published in the aftermath of Chow's demise based on Chattopadhyay's testimony reveals more details I missed at first glance. Chattopadhyay returned to the island a second time with Pandit in February of 1991 with an even larger group than before, and apparently the administration wanted to make the Sentinelese familiar with all of them, maybe pointing to the hopes that the islanders would open up sustained contact, though I'm not sure about that. Chattopadhyay repeats the detail that one or maybe multiple Sentinels find the Queen's boat and an entire bag of coconuts, and they even tried to take the rifle belonging to the police, mistaking it to be a piece of metal. Or maybe not. Who knows? And she repeats the fact that the expedition ended with a knife being drawn, in a manner similar to what Pandit remembers. But she added that it was only because one of the team members tried to take an ornament made out of leaves worn by a Sentinel. 2 months later, she embarked on yet another but poor weather conditions spoiled it, and they didn't land. They didn't even see any of the Sentinelese. But I think the most intriguing detail she adds that, according to her, the reason the first expedition wasn't cut short by arrow fire was because she spoke to the Sentinelese using some Andamanese words she'd picked up while doing fieldwork among the other tribes, which incited the Sentinelese woman to chastise her male counterpart for aiming at the expedition. But frustratingly, the article doesn't specify whether she was using Ongi or Jarwa, and even what word she used, but she did apparently overhear what she thought was an identifiable phrase in the Jarwa language, Nariyela Jabba Jabba, which, now that I'm saying it out loud, it sort of sounds sick, but it very well could be, since that's only a quote-unquote hunch. Another recent article in Nature, this time from 2024, adds that a piece of coral was thrown by one of the Sentinelese men, and Pandit became separated from the group, who were apparently oblivious to what was going on. It also taught me that, contrary to my previous assumptions, official expeditions to North Sentinel Island are still being launched, but they seem to keep more of a distance now. They're run by a wing of the government to handle the welfare of the native Andamanese called the Andaman Janjati Vika Samiti, AAJVS, and they're only meant to ensure the social well-being of the Sentinelese people and to gain headcounts of them. The Portland Expedition, 1880. There's one traumatic incident in particular that probably explains a lot of the instances but it didn't happen in the 21st century, in the 20th century. It happened in January of 1880, and everything we know about it comes from the man who instigated it, the serious upper-class colonial administrator named Maurice Vidal Portland, on the Andaman Islands, who was still ruled by the British. He played a big part in the story, visiting it off and on from 1880 to 1895, and crucially, gave us some of our earliest and most detailed insight into the islanders' culture and their relationships with the other Andamanese. But that's near the bottom of the iceberg, so you'll have to wait for those juicy, juicy details. Portland was born in 1860 to an aristocratic family. His grandfather had even been a Viking, so he was sort of in the peerage. But for whatever reason, he seems to have severed ties with his family and headed to the East Indies, where at only 19 years old, he was made officer in charge of the Andamanese in 1879. He was extraordinarily curious about them and their lifestyle, though in a rather strange, condescending way typical of a Victorian. For example, he once said, "In many ways, they closely resemble the average lower-class English country schoolboy." I don't know if that's a compliment to the Andamanese or an insult to the English lower class or both, but that's what he said. Portman was also oddly fond of taking photographs of them in different artificial and often poses. So I should mention here that there are allegations that he was a predator, but other sources claim that he was genuinely well-loved amongst the Andamanese, to the envy of other contemporary anthropologists. But again, on the flip side, he also ran these things that were known as Andaman homes, which were essentially orphanages meant to inject British civilization into kidnapped Andamanese people, and he reportedly ran them efficiently and constantly for longer than anyone else. By the time he retired in 1901, including a 2-volume book entitled The History of details his different forays onto the Central. But his first expedition there, undertaken only months after arriving in the Andes, is the best known of them by far. I've heard it repeated again and again, but often with crucial details missing. And there's a reason why it's the best known of them. It's shocking. But in order to give you the full picture, let me read what I can't do the accent, I just destroy my lungs. So enjoy this other horrible English accent. Early in January 1880, I paid a visit to the North Central Island. We saw tracks of Indians, but none of the Aborigines. On the 26th of the same month, I went again to the IGS Constance and stopped there for a fortnight. Captain Allen and Lieutenant Hooper of the Constance and Lieutenant H.H. Doherty of the European Detachment in Port there accompanied me and making a very search throughout the interior of the island. The villages, weapons, and defenses of the North Sentinel people, I insist that, are exactly the same as those of the Onges, and so far as I can tell, their customs seem to be the same. One day, while marching through the jungle, we came upon a camp of Jarwals, then an umbrella term essentially spit, and captured a woman and 4 children unhurt. These were kept for a few days on board the Constance, and the woman and 1 child were then released with a quantity of presents. The Constance, a sailing schooner, went back to Port Moet for a day, during which time Lieutenant Hooper and I camped on a small island on the northwest edge of the center. Observed the capture of a forest fire, lighted as a beacon for the Constance, the steer side extracted a very large number of sea sticks and hydrocarbons, which wrapped around us on the sand. That might certain death, effectively vanished. Anyway, a few days later, crossing the island from the southeast to the western coast, Lieutenant Cooper and I met on a tract in the middle of the forest, an old man with his wife and child. Our party was spread out in crescent formation, and the Jarwals came to the center where Lieutenant Cooper and I were. The old man drawn his bow and fired at Lieutenant Cooper's head when I caught the door. A Pakistani, Amir, who had been stationed at the right point of the crest and had got his call by the Jarwals, jumped on his back and spoiled his aim. We caught the 3 unhurt and brought them on board. The next day we took the 6 Jarwal into Port, where I kept them in my house. Some days they sickened rapidly, and the old man and his wife died. So the 4 children were sent back to their home with quantities of presents. Remarkable, and this seems to be left out of most other sources that quote Portman. He actually felt a little bit of self-awareness and recognized that the mission was an abject failure, though he does throw his fellow colonial Mr. Humphrey under the bus a bit. This expedition was not a success, for misled by Mr. Humphrey's statements regarding the numbers and ferocity of the Aborigines, they were met in a less conciliatory manner than was desirable, and we cannot be said to have done anything more than increase their general terror of and hostility to all comers. It would have been better to have left the islanders alone until the Onges of the Little Andaman were tamed, and then to have approached them with the assistance of the latter. The facts which justify this view were not, however, known at the time. Later, after finding an Onge interpreter named Tomiti, he wound up bringing him to North Sentinel in an attempt at communicating, which ultimately failed. In addition to this, Portman provides an almost unparalleled glimpse into the island's physical terrain.